battle is brewing within the Democratic Party between teachers and parents of students. Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. If you share my concerns, maybe you could like this video and subscribe to this channel, maybe even click that little bell that will notify you when I post something new. So Democrats are dealing with an increasingly difficult situation. Teachers and teachers' unions concerned about the fact that they could be exposed to the deadly COVID virus have been protesting, in some places engaging in sick-outs, where essentially teachers call in sick so that there aren't enough teachers to be able to staff schools. Teachers' unions all across the country, including both in more liberal areas and more conservative areas, are calling for more remote learning because they believe that protects them from transmission of the virus. Well, certainly that is the case, but at what price? And as the grandfather of a 6-year-old child who has engaged in remote learning at various times over the past 2 years, I can tell you that the price is high. Perhaps the group most victimized by this pandemic and the lockdowns associated with it have been our children. Research has clearly shown that children do not learn as well on a remote basis as they do in a face-to-face situation. And there's widespread evidence that teenagers especially are dealing with higher rates of mental illness as a result of the isolation they've been experiencing as a result of these lockdowns. The sad truth, as David Leonhardt pointed out in the New York Times, and of course I'll link to the articles down below, is that essentially we're in a situation right now where we're forcing our children to go through incredible hardship to protect people who are refusing to get vaccinated. How does that seem fair? Well, it isn't. Now, as a teacher myself, I can sympathize with the concerns that teachers' unions across the country are expressing. And I'm sure many of them are parents as well, who, like me, have ambivalent feelings about the whole situation. On the one hand, wanting their children to get the best possible education, which is done on a face-to-face basis, while on the other hand, wanting to make sure that they themselves and their families are kept safe from a deadly virus. The efforts of these teachers' unions, who are among some of the strongest and most loyal supporters of Democrats, is a problem for Democrats because, as we saw in the Virginia governor's race, and we've seen in other polling, moving to remote learning is a big problem for swing voters who the Democrats are relying upon, especially suburban women. And if we start to see widespread remote learning again, then that will certainly become a burden that Democrats will have a hard time overcoming. The truth is, though, that this virus that we're dealing with now is quite a bit different from the virus that we were dealing with initially. And I'm not just talking about the Omicron versus the Delta or the previous variants. What I'm talking about is the fact that society is now more prepared for it. A high percentage of people are vaccinated, and frankly, most of the people who are refusing to, well, it's hard for me to feel sorry for them, frankly. We also have mountains of research now about the nature of the virus and how it's transmitted. And we know that it's not that dangerous to children and that there are measures that can be taken to make sure that teachers are protected. Things like, for example, wearing N95 masks. Now, I can tell you for a fact, as someone who needs to teach wearing a mask, teaching with a mask is not easy, but it's certainly preferable to the alternative, which is teaching over remote. So unfortunately, I'm in the situation where I understand the frustrations of both parties, both the teachers and the parents. And I am really concerned about the future our children are facing as a result of the hardships they've had to endure in this crisis. Frankly, the hardships they've had to endure on behalf of everybody else, many of whom have refused to participate in the efforts to mitigate this crisis. I think, though, what we're seeing here in some respects is an example of the chickens coming home to roost. After all, society has basically undervalued teachers and shat all over them now for years. Teaching, which in my opinion should be viewed as one of the most honorable professions. I mean, after all, Jesus referred to himself as rabbi, which in Hebrew means teacher. But here in the United States, it's seen as something which is not valuable, which just amazes me that we don't think that taking care of our children and educating them is the foremost priority we have. Truth be told, though, there's been this dichotomy of public opinion that goes way back in the United States, where efforts to prioritize children are always viewed as kind of secondary to efforts to take care of senior citizens. Because, after all, senior citizens are going to be senior citizens for the rest of their lives, and they all vote, whereas parents of young students, well, at some point, they will age out of that era, and they tend to vote in lower percentages than senior citizens. But this really disturbs me that senior citizens don't view educating children and taking care of the future something that's part of the legacy that they can leave to the country after they're gone. I mean, this dichotomy of public opinion is likely the reason why the dependent child tax credit, which literally deposited $250 to $300 a month into the bank accounts of parents, was allowed to expire, which just amazes me. This tax credit was a public policy triumph, actually reducing child poverty. And among those who receive it, it was incredibly popular. And yet, it was allowed to expire. Why? Because again, we have this dichotomy where we undervalue our children and the public policies that benefit them. So I think the biggest step that needs to be taken right now is something that tries to reverse that. And the policy I would suggest that could make that happen is, frankly, simply to pay our teachers more. Yes, we should make sure that they have the supplies that they need in the classroom, including things such as N95 masks. Yes, we should make sure that the classrooms are set up in a way that it's harder for the virus to be transmitted from one person to the next. But let's face it, in America, the way that we determine people's value is based upon how they're paid. And teachers, especially relative to the level of education that they need, are among some of the lowest paid in our country. How does that make any sense? Now, part of the challenge in accomplishing this has been the fact that school budgets are largely funded by property taxes, a burden that falls very heavily upon senior citizens who've paid off their homes. The property tax revolts of the 1970s and early 1980s were largely driven by the fact that senior citizens were losing their homes that they'd paid off as a result of rapidly increasing property taxes. You can certainly see where that would be something deeply upsetting, and where people would demand some kind of limitation on that. But there are other ways we can tax people. The most progressive, of course, would be some type of wealth tax. But there are other income taxes that would burden the extremely wealthy much more heavily than average people, helping to undo some of the damage that the Trump tax giveaway to billionaires provided. One thing I'd like to see enter the conversation, in addition to universal pre-K and funding for childcare, should be a national line item for higher teacher salaries. The way to provide this would be for the Department of Education to essentially have funds available that they can provide as grants to support schools that pay their teachers more money. This is great because then it creates essentially a market where teachers will be able to bid up their services based upon being able to go to other districts that are willing to apply for these grants for the Department of Education, as opposed to those school districts that insist on paying their teachers less. Such grants are not unprecedented. We saw them during the 1990s when there were efforts to increase the presence of police forces on the ground. And there were national grants available to assist local police departments in doing that. What's more, if we've seen multiple calls for doctors and nurses and emergency responders, and frankly, other essential workers, including grocery store workers, for example, to be paid more as a result of the risks that they need to incur in serving the public. Well, I think it's fair to say that teachers are emergency workers at this point. And the fact that we continue to undervalue them, especially given the important role that they play in society, the high responsibility they have, and the high level of education that they're required to do their jobs. So I'm calling in America to finally treat teachers like the important employees that they are, and to find a mechanism to make sure that they're compensated fairly, especially in light of the demands that we're placing on them during this what now seems to be practically unending pandemic. Well, if you agree with me or disagree with me, I'd love to see your comments down below. And if you could like this video and subscribe to this channel, that'd be a huge help. Here's another video, by the way, about what Democrats need to do to protect union jobs. I'll see you in the next video. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.